So before we get started, I do just want to say, since we are getting kind of close to midterm here, that I know that this is a ridiculously small class, and I really appreciate that both of you always show up and always show up on time and always seem more or less ready to go. It is not easy to teach this material to only two people at a time. So, the fact that you've both been, so cooperative has been really, really great. So for next time, we're going to be reading book 3 of On the Social Contract. And book 3 is the longest part of the book, so it's going to be a little bit more material to absorb. But we're going to try to lay some groundwork for it today. And again, I want you to try to choose a quote to free write about. So as far as today's program is concerned, the first thing I want to do is give you a chance to ask any questions you have about book 2, which was today's reading, or about Rousseau in general. Then, since we didn't really get to last time, we're going to go over some of the important points of book 1. And I want to wrap up today by trying to define some of the key terms that he uses in book 2, right? So let's start here with questions. What questions or comments or observations do you guys have about this so far? Is there anything that's particularly confusing you, or anything that you found particularly interesting or weird about this?
Talking about Hobbs.
Okay.
And then when we moved to book 2, we started talking about how Rousseau's philosophies.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there's a shift in book 2, right, where he's talking less about other people who've come before him, right, and more about kind of expounding on his own ideas. But let's look at book 1 for a second here, at where he's talking about Hobbs and Grotius, and where we get an idea of what he thinks of them. So can we turn to page 2? Right, when he's talking about the first societies, right? Grotius denies that all human power is established in favor of the governed, and quotes slavery as an example. His usual method of reasoning is constantly to establish right by fact. Right, so essentially what this means is that Grotius kind of, instead of thinking about the way things could be or ought to be, tends to assume that the way things are is the only way they can be, right? Does that make sense? Okay. It will be possible to employ a more logical method, but none could be more favorable to tyrants. It is then, according to Grotius, doubtful whether the human race belongs to 100 men, or that 100 men to the human race. And throughout his book, he seems to incline to the former alternative, which is also the view of Hobbes. On this showing, the human species is divided into so many herds of cattle, each with its ruler, who keeps guard over them for the purpose of devouring them. So let's think back for a second to what the views Rousseau is critiquing here were, right? What do we remember about Hobbes's view from last time? According to Hobbes, why do people form societies? What was Hobbes's version of the social contract? Do you remember that picture I showed you last time of the king with a sword and a scepter made up of hundreds of different bodies?
Oh, with all the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people have their natural rights, they'll kill each other.
Yeah, the human beings left in a state of nature, right, that is without law or government, have no reason to cooperate with each other, right? That we form societies essentially for protection from each other. And in doing so, we vest authority in a king, right, or some other such figure that has the is the only person in the kingdom with the right to commit legal violence, right? The kingdom can declare war, the king or the government can declare police actions, things like that, right? And it's all for the protection of our property from our neighbors. So let's think about here what Rousseau says about Hobbes's view, right, which is also more or less Grotius's view, right? On this showing, the human species is divided into so many herds of cattle, each with its ruler, who keeps guard over them for the purpose of devouring them. So what's the metaphor here that Rousseau is using? What's he comparing to what?
Human species, the herds of cattle.
Okay, yeah, so human beings. To herds of cattle. Probably a little more like maybe human societies to herds of cattle, right? And how does Rousseau justify this comparison? At least in his reading of Hobbes's views, how are human societies like herds of cattle?
So they have somebody who watch over them.
Okay, yeah, someone has to watch over them, right? Right, there has to be a cow herd, probably with a good dog, right, who has to keep them in line, keep them from wandering off. And what else, like, what else, like, what are cattle?
Isn't that like cows or something?
Yeah, cows, right? And do we regard cattle as having independent wills of their own? So we're talking about animals, right? And do we use the term cattle to refer to free herds of animals wandering the wilderness? Yeah. When do animals become cattle?
When they in the farm, in the herd?
Yeah, we're in the herd and the farm, right? And do they belong to themselves?
They belong to the farm.
They belong to the rancher, yeah. So cattle are also property, right? So as we sort of pick this apart here, what is Rousseau saying about Hobbes's view of human societies? What does he view, or how does he read Hobbes's views here? Why does he make this comparison? what does Hobbes, according to Rousseau, think people are?
And
Yeah, they're basically animals, right? And that they can only be contained, right, when they're someone else's property. Right, when the ruler takes charge over them and keeps them in line. But note, like the last clause here, he says, each with its ruler who keeps guard over them for the purpose of devouring them. So what does Rousseau think of Hobbes's idea of a king or a government? Does he think that Hobbes's idea of government actually benefits the people? Yeah, then in fact, yeah, it benefits the king, right? Or the government,
like
not the people.
person, sacrifice.
Yeah. Just taking from the people, right? Taking for it's, yeah, I watch over you for the purpose of devouring you later, whether that's, fleecing you with excessive taxes or extracting labor from you, right? Or some other such thing. So let's then compare this to what Rousseau regards as a natural society. What's the only society Rousseau thinks is natural? Right, that doesn't have to be constructed. It's in the same section. That's maybe a little bit more general than we're going for. Look at the beginning of the section labeled the first societies. What's the only society Rousseau regards as natural? The family. The most ancient of all societies, and the only one that is natural, is the family. And even so, the children remain attached to the father only so long as they need him for their preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children, released from the obedience they owed to the father, and the father, released from the care he owed his children, return equally to independence. If they remain united, they continue so no longer naturally but voluntarily, and the family itself is then maintained only by convention. So let's kind of think about this as a social structure. So what are the characteristics here that Rousseau assigns to a family? Like, how does a family work as a society?
The family only together as long as children.
Yeah, the family only needs to remain together as long as the members of that family feel either need each other or feel some obligation to each other, right? So there are ties of need and obligation, right, produced by nature. But then once the children are old enough to fend for themselves, right, then they no longer need the family, right? And each person is, rendered independent again. So a family that stays together is a voluntary society, right? Right. People who stay together longer than they actually need to for their own survival do so voluntarily. Now, this is different from a herd of cattle, right? Which stays together because, a cow herd, puts them into a corral, right? Or because a dog nips at their heels if they get out of line. So how then is Rousseau's basic view of society different from Hobbes's and Grotius's? Think about other. Oh, go ahead, Morgan. What are you gonna say?
What you about to say?
What's that?
I said, what you about to say?
No, you go first.
Okay. Hobbs believe people are like animals. Rousseau believe think people should have their independence on like the general will.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that says something. I think. Well, yeah. Which of these guys seems to think that people are more intelligent and more capable of making free choices? Rousseau, absolutely, right? Yeah. So the fact that he, talks about this kind of voluntary family, right? Yeah, suggests that he thinks of people of having, right, free will and intelligence. And he doesn't think that Hobbes would agree with this, right? At least in Rousseau's reading, Hobbes thinks that people need to be roped in, corralled, contained, right? Can't be left to make their own choices. Let's think about like what other things we tend to associate with the idea of a family too, as we're kind of unpacking this metaphor here. What connotations does the word family have?
They're united.
Pardon?
They're united.
Okay, yeah, unite. Yeah, people who are united, right, by blood, if by nothing else, right, by genetics. What else? What other ideas do we associate with family?
Inheritance.
Okay, inheritance. Yeah, that things come down to us from our parents and from our ancestors, right? So, our free will is a kind of inheritance. And what do we usually think of as the thing that unites a family, apart from, say, genetics?
The parent.
What's that?
The parent.
Okay, yeah, parents. Certainly, yeah, we're talking about a different kind of authority figure than Hobbes envisions, right? How are parents different from a herdsman?
Parents don't treat you like animals.
Yeah, at least if you're lucky and are born into a decent family, right? Your parents will not treat you like an animal. Well, plus, the herdsman has no real connection to the cows, right? They're not even the same species. So I think that in this cattle metaphor, right, we're talking about things that are different in kind. And not just in degree, right? It's not just the herdsman isn't a superior form of cow, right? He's something entirely different from the cows. Whereas the difference between parents and children is a difference of degree, right? They're both human, they're all human beings, but the parents are older human beings that are invested with authority over the children, right? Particularly as long as the children still need them for their preservation or for their survival. But what do we think of as binding parents to their children? Why do parents feel an obligation to their children, to take care of their children, provide for their preservation?
It's instinct.
Okay.
And two is the law.
What's that?
I said it's the law, but it's instinct.
Okay, it is the law, yes. If you don't take care of your kids, right, then yeah, the law comes after you. But yeah, it's our instinct to want to take care of smaller versions of ourselves, right? And yeah, so when this is voluntary, it tends to take the form of love rather than of, the kind of authority that the herdsman wields over the cows. Or, the herdsman might care for his cows, right? My grandfather was a dairy farmer, and he certainly took very good care of his animals. Cared about their welfare and all that. But you can't care about a cow in quite the same way you can another human being, right? If you do, then maybe you should seek help.
Dog owners do it.
What's that?
I said dog lovers do it.
Hey, well, dogs are different. It's totally different with dogs. My dog would talk if she could. If her vocal cords were differently constituted. But you see where I'm going here, right? You see like kind of where how these opposing metaphors are set up here at different ends of this section. Right? We start with the family as a metaphor for a kind of natural state, right? And then we go to, but these other guys say that the state is more like a herdsman taking care of his cows, right? Who are going to be milked and eaten at the end of the process. So this gives us some sense of a different kind of direction that Rousseau wants to take from previous social contract thinkers, right? So were there other questions y'all had, or other places you guys wanted to point to before we move on here? Okay, then I want to turn to page 1 here for a second. And I want you to think about, before I start going any deeper into this, the time Rousseau is writing in the 1760s, would you call France, as we have described it in class, and as Voltaire described his own society in Candide, does it sound to you like what you would call a free society? Why not?
Because the king has all the power.
King has all the power. The church backs him up, right? And what's left for that poor third estate? The everybody else. What's left for them? Yeah, not a whole hell of a lot, right? So, on page 1, Rousseau says he was born a citizen of a free state. Why do you think he would say that? I'm going to admit right away that this is a little bit of a trick question. Why would he say he's born a citizen of a free state? If France was not a free state in the 1760s.
Because he feel like he could do better. Like if you keep reading down.
I feel that however feeble the influence of my voice can have on public affairs, the right of voting on them makes it my duty to study them, and I am happy when I reflect upon governments, to find my inquiries always furnish me with new reasons for loving that of my own country. But he says he was born a citizen of a free state, right? So he started out. He came into the world a citizen of a free state, right? So if France is not a free state,
So how do you born a citizen?
how is he born a citizen of a free state? Yes, that's a good, yep.
Okay, maybe he is and maybe it's his state around.
Okay, state that it's metaphorical. That's a good guess, but it isn't. The the correct answer is that he's not French. His name is French, but he's actually Swiss. Rousseau is was born in Switzerland. So he's not French. He's moving in French society, right? He's a French-speaking Swiss person, right? He's writing in France, and he's looking at it from an outsider's perspective, right? He's not actually a French citizen. Now, this first sentence of section 1 here is, man is born free. And everywhere he is in chains. Is probably the best known and most frequently quoted sentence in the book. Partly because it's one of the very first sentences, and let's be honest, a lot of people don't get past the first page. But let's think about what assumptions are baked into this, right? So, man is born free. What does that mean? What's that?
They're going right in ties to whatever they're living.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I guess it depends on how we define free, right? So you're born without ties, without obligations. Able to will whatever we choose, right? So if we're born free, right, then freedom is our natural state before anything else happens to us, right? And everywhere he is in chains. How do we read that? So our natural state is freedom. And yet, everywhere we are in chains.
Because you still being ruled by somebody.
Okay, wherever you happen to be born, right, once you are in the world, you are subject to the rules of whatever society you're born into, right?
So you born free, but you still got to follow the rules.
Yeah. And these rules, right, if we're talking about people being in chains, do these sound like rules that are made fairly by the people themselves for the benefit of everyone? Yeah, what does in chains suggest?
Rules to keep them bound together.
Yeah. People are bound, right? I mean, what sorts of people are kept in chains? Slaves, prisoners, right? So man is born free. And everywhere he is a slave or a prisoner, right? Of someone else's will. So, what Rousseau is trying to do is figure out how we got to this, right? From that natural state of freedom. And what to do about it, right? How to build a society that is based on the consent of everyone rather than the whims of a few very rich or very powerful people, right? So, if we look on page 3, the section titled "The Right of the Strongest." Right? It says the strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right and obedience into duty. Hence the right of the strongest, which, though to all seeming meant ironically, is really laid down as a fundamental principle. But are we never to have an explanation of this phrase? Force is a physical power, and I fail to see what moral effect it can have. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will. At most, an act of prudence. In what sense can it be a duty? So, a cowherd ruling over his cattle, right, essentially rules through force, right, not through the consent of the cattle. Does Rousseau seem to regard force as a legitimate basis for rule? Do I have a right to, make you read chapters of difficult French political philosophy books by threatening you with force if you don't? Yeah, do I have the right to make you read difficult French political philosophy books by threatening you with force if you don't? No. If I were doing that, I really should be fired, right? Yeah, I would not be a responsible educator. Likewise, Rousseau doesn't believe that a king or any other government body has the right to force people to comply, right? That force is not a legitimate basis for government, right? He says in the section on slavery, in the first sentence there, since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men. So, since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, what does this suggest about things we talked about last time, like the divine right of kings? Yeah, that no one gets special Rousseau is arguing that nobody gets special powers from God, right? That everybody, at least initially, right, in the state of nature, is actually equal. That no one is elevated by nature over other people.
That's why in one of these he said, I don't remember which page it was, one he said men are born equal, something like that.
Yeah. In fact, in several places he stresses this, right? We may not have equal things, right? We may not always have equal abilities, but we are born into the world equal in status to one another, right? In terms of our natural rights. Everyone has the same natural rights. And this, for him, is kind of like the basis of forming societies, right? Anything beyond that is the result of social constructs. And if the constructs of the society that you live in are flawed, right? If they're built on a faulty premise, like, say, force, then you need to go back to square one and construct a new society, right? So, does this make sense on the whole? Everybody with me? Or is there anything that's a little bit confusing about this? And we can see how it's a response to stuff that we talked about last time. More or less.
I actually tried when I did in my quote weekend.
Okay, good. Tell me what you did. What did you write about?
I wrote about general will.
Okay.
And then I said how I don't remember which part it was. I remember reading it, but it was like the king or somebody is not happy, but he still can be around people that's happy, something like that. And I put how Pegloss and the Baron they made like a specific rule.
Okay.
Everybody they had to follow, but
Uh-huh.
he didn't follow about Voltaire follow.
Okay, yeah. And I think like we even kind of see at the end of Candide, right? That kind of little mini society they're creating amongst themselves as the expression of a kind of general will. It's like, we all work together for the good of our little community, right? I think that's actually kind of where I want to go next. I want to try to define some of these terms that Rousseau is using, especially in Book 2 here. Like general will. Sovereign. And legislator. So instead of like me standing up here and lecturing and asking you all questions, what I'd like the two of you to do is huddle together for a few minutes and see if you can come up with what you think Rousseau's definitions of these terms are together. And then we'll come back and discuss it. And I'm here to answer questions if you want to ask me questions. But yeah, I want to see how far you two can get with this together. Which means one of you will need to move.
The first one is like common good.
Yeah, like overall.
So generally, common good and common interest. Page 17. but I don't know what it's saying. The legislature is someone who doesn't show emotion but still can go through much.
It's like creator, because they're human, and each sometimes, yeah, and it's the engineer, or that's the machine.
Okay. All right, what do you got?
General will is the common good or common interest.
Okay, common good or common interest. Okay. And who decides what the common good or the common interest is?
The people overall.
Yeah, basically everyone working in concert, right? So, I mean, it's this. I'm gonna admit that like this is all a little bit difficult because Rousseau never actually comes out and says this is what I mean by the general will, right? It's kind of inferred throughout the book. But yes, it's the common good, the common interest. It's made up of everyone. And can the general will actually be divided? Pardon?
No, because something everybody has to agree on, right?
Yeah. The general will is actually not divisible, right? As soon as it divides into factions or breaks up into groups, you don't have a general will anymore.
That's what you would.
Yeah. And so those who are in a minority on any position, right, have to be willing, in Rousseau's view, to go along with majority rule, majority decisions in order for society to continue to function, right? Right. He makes a lot of distinctions between the general or the common and the particular, right? So common interests being those that affect everyone, right? You know, the interest, what's best for everyone. And our particular interests being things that are good for us, right? And in Rousseau's formulation, the general interest always outweighs the particular interest of the individual, right? That we have to freely submit to the general will for the sake of the common good. What about sovereign? What does he seem to mean by the sovereign?
I think it's just the people, because they are the ones that make up the laws, and so they have to be like the ones in power.
Okay, I think the in power thing there is the key to the definition, right? What does the sovereign actually do?
It's kind of like a ruler.
Yeah.
The power.
So, does the ruler make laws, at least in Rousseau's system here? What's the ruler's function?
The ruler is like, well, in here it's like a mechanic who sets regulations.
Yeah. So we can think of this as being like, even like in our Constitution, right? Like, what's the job of the executive branch?
Make the law.
Does the executive branch make the laws?
Oh, they don't care.
Yeah, it's the function of the executive branch to carry out the laws, right? So, like, for example, the president doesn't make laws, right? But he can issue signing statements. He can veto laws, or he can issue what are called signing statements that dictate how a law is supposed to be enforced, right? Even though he can't actually make or amend laws, right? So yeah, the sovereign is basically the executive who enforces the laws. And then if the sovereign enforces the laws, then what does the legislator do?
They make
Yeah, the legislator is the person who makes the laws. So the sovereign puts the laws into effect. The legislator draws them up. Right? I think that metaphor you were pointing to a moment ago, Morgan. Where the the legislator is the engineer who invents the machine. The prince merely the mechanic who sets it up and makes it go. So. What's the difference between an engineer and a mechanic?
The engineer builds a car, the mechanic fixes the car. Or something.
Uh-huh. Yeah, does an engineer just build? What else does an engineer do before you can even build something? Yeah, the engineer designs it, right? Right, whereas the mechanic maintains it or repairs it. So the engineer is engaged in what is essentially a creative act, right? Whereas the mechanic is not. It's merely kind of carrying out instructions, right? It's sort of tinkering with something someone else has already built. So, which function do you think Rousseau regards as more important based on this metaphor? The function of the legislator or the function of the sovereign? Okay, yeah, because if the sovereign is enforcing poorly made laws, right? Society suffers. Right. It's how well the laws are made that dictates how good and how just your society is. And did you notice anything else that was kind of interesting or weird about the way Rousseau describes the legislator? What does his ideal legislator look like?
find it weird that you feel like the legislature should have ties with the people. It should like just be there.
Uh-huh. Yeah, he says, yeah, the best legislators are outsiders, right? Yeah, people who come from someplace else. You know, kind of like maybe Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Coming into France from Switzerland. When Lycurgus, on page 26, gave laws to his country, he began by resigning the throne. It was the custom of most Greek towns to entrust the establishment of their laws to foreigners. The republics of modern Italy in many cases followed this example. Geneva did the same and profited by it. Rome, when it was most prosperous, suffered a revival of all the crimes of tyranny and was brought to the verge of destruction because it put the legislative authority and the sovereign power into the same hands. So, does Rousseau think that the sovereign and the legislator should ever be the same person or the same body of people? Yeah, these two need to be kept separate, right? He does not think that the person who enacts and enforces the laws should be the same person as the one who draws them up. That this leads to corruption and societal breakdown. And I think it's also worth noting what he regards as the importance of lawmaking. If you look on page 25, right, after the metaphor you guys cited, the legislator is the engineer metaphor, right? At the birth of society, says Montesquieu, the rulers of republics establish institutions, and afterwards the institutions mold the rulers. So what does that mean? At the birth of societies, the rulers of republics establish institutions, and afterwards the institutions mold the rulers. At the birth of societies, the rulers of republics establish institutions, and afterwards the institutions mold the rulers. So when you're setting up a nation or a state or any political body, right, you have to start by setting up institutions, right? So the ruler or the legislator at the beginning of a society's life sets up the laws and social conventions and all that, right? But then once all of those things are set into place, what happens? Do the people continue to shape the laws, or do the laws shape the people and the rulers?
The law should be people.
Yeah, the argument here is that people conform to the laws and the existing institutions, right? And if you set up good laws at the beginning of your society, then the rulers will themselves be good, right? If you set up bad laws at the beginning of your society, then it'll encourage the rulers to be bad. So the legislator's work sets the rules the sovereign has to abide by, and that'll shape the sovereign's kind of general personality orientation, right? So, does this make sense? Okay, because for next time, what we're going to be looking at is essentially the way Rousseau classifies different forms of government, right? And how well particular forms of government meet the standards that he set up in the first two books. So let me give you the guide questions for that. And then we'll let you go a little bit early because we started early.